Is it?
Do you schedule random rants before every talk? This is my first. Yeah, sure. Can we have like a Bruce rant track?
Right, yeah, I even never mind. So this is obviously not why you're here, so I'm going to get off the stage. Yeah, everyone's like, get the hell out of here.
Wish you could tell us how to crack iTunes.
So these guys,
Thankfully, Apple has not changed the face of security enough. There are buffer overflows all over OS X that you will see all over the place as soon as they switch processors publicly, because then people will be like, screw this, I'm not going to reverse engineer PPC when I can reverse Intel.
Right, I mean, so you've got this platform that nobody used, and further, like, it does pre-binding. Anyone know what pre-binding is? Yeah, one guy. Okay, like their library system and how they handle it, unlike anything else that goes on, and people have never tried to poke holes in it. I think you get all these weird things, a mock microkernel and this pre-binding crap and all this other stuff on a common architecture everybody else uses. Man, it's going to go from like the Uber Secure OS to the Uber Pwned OS in like a year.
Especially since they rewrote all of the memory handling at the kernel level, so I mean, it's never been tested. It's not like all reused code like everything else is at this point. So.
Yeah, that doesn't end well. So neither does my talk. So these guys are going to have a BOF on Snort. So feel free to throw stuff. They are more than willing to accept Shmoocon fire and probably deserve it for a variety of reasons. So they're not a problem. I'm just helping you out, man. Just helping you out. So here's Cazz and Lorraine to talk about Snort.
I don't like microphone stands. Yeah. So my name is Brian Caswell. I am a principal research engineer for SourceFire. This is Lorraine. She is also a research engineer. She doesn't really do Snort things. She writes exploits for us at SourceFire. So since SourceFire asked me to come and she was at the conference, she's going to be my spacebar bitch. So I have to say thank you to Lorraine. Hit spacebar, please. All right, so what I am, I'm going to do a really quick introduction to myself, a little bit of the stuff that I've been doing, and then talk a bunch about stuff that's going on in the public space regarding Snort. I'm not going to really talk about the external projects. I know most of you probably went to Richard's talk about Squeal. I'm not going to talk about those. If you want to talk about those, feel free. Richard and any of the other guys that have Snort projects, feel free to come up and we can talk about those, whatever you guys want to talk about. Like I said, real quick, I'm going to do a quick introduction to Snort, where Snort is going in my perspective, and then we'll open up to whatever you guys want to talk about. The other thing that I want to talk about, after we do all my little bit of introduction, I'm going to go into the Open Snort Consortium, talking about the rules and what things are going to go on with that. So that'll be in there too. All right, so like I said, I'm a principal research engineer for SourceFire. I don't work for Checkpoint yet. The SEC has not granted the approval yet. Supposedly in the next month or so, I will work for an Israeli firm. Yeah, Marty made lots of money, I didn't. All right, I have worked on all of the Singers-related Snort books. I am no longer the Snort rules Nazi. Every time I introduce myself, I'm no longer the Snort rules Nazi, since I'm not allowed to call myself that. I'm a Perl monkey, and lately, thanks to the Metasploit version 3 being rewritten in Ruby, I have to write Ruby all day long.
All right, I'm Lorraine. I'm a research engineer with Brian. Usually, what I end up doing is reverse engineering patches and writing the exploits. And I was about to say that, actually. But yeah, writing the exploits, figuring out triggering conditions for writing Snort rules, stuff like that, doing stuff like that. But yeah, that's a quote that came out from Brian's Snort rule Nazi days. There are a list of 10 things that Matt came up with that were rules for the Snort list, and one of them is Brian is not mean, except he is mean, but he's right and mean, so that's why he's the Snort rules Nazi.
All right, so again, this is the agenda that we're going to go through. We're going to real quick go over Snort. We're going to look at a couple of old Snort rules, how we're writing Snort rules inside of SourceFire, give you a little bit of a glimpse into to my mind. We're going to talk about where Snort rules are going, because I'm sure you probably all are at least a little bit interested. We're going to talk about the open source consortium, and then open it up for generic Snort stuff. All right, so Snort is an IDS. It's free. And it's got a simple rules language. That's my entire introduction to Snort. If you're at the Snort BOF and you don't know anything about Snort, you might as well leave. All right, so Snort rules then. This is actually not really then, this is Snort rules as they exist right now. This is not really all that readable. So this rule looks for an attack via DCRPC to the, no, this is not WMF.
Oh, sorry, that's a 5.
This is, I think, for the SAMR DCRPC service. So this is some really unreadable gobbledygook, and it's a full page of unreadable gobbledygook. So when you're looking at Snort rules, when you're trying to write rules for a new vulnerability, you have to remember where all the offsets are for each of the things in the DCRPC packet, how all the different fragmentation works, how all the, where all the different fields work. Well, not everybody can remember the packet layout structure for TCP in their head, much less all the layers on top of that. Well, in order to limit the amount of mistakes that the SourceFire research team makes, is I've written code generators for all the protocols that we handle on a day-to-day basis. So I'm going to show you a really good example of that, which we use currently. So this is the rule generator for the rule before that. So the vulnerability is actually an MSDTC. So and it is an attack on the build context W command via DCRPC. MSDTC listens on 2 different DCRPC services. It listens on DCRPC Direct, which is 135 on TCP, and then it listens over DCRPC Direct via UDP, so 135 over UDP. So what we do is we write a rule that's specific to the DCRPC spec. So by saying, listing the protocols, I handle all of the things that are need to be done for the protocol. So we know this is a MSDTC attack, so we look for the bind, we set up flow bits for that. That's all handled automatically. And then we say we want to look for the op-down, the build context function. And we know that's always in a static place, so we look for that automatically. And then in DCRPC requests, you do a bind, and then you do a function call. You provide a function call number and your arguments. So one of the things is I wrote, so those are called where all the data comes from is a stub, what they call a stub section. So I make it so you can write really generic descriptions for how to do detection inside of the stub data. So for example, there are 7 longs in the beginning of the vulnerable function for bind context W. So what we do, if you look at the first entry in the stub data hash, is I skip 7 times 4, so I skip 7 longs. Then I skip a DCRPC wide string, which is how most strings are transported across the network for DCRPC. Skip another wide string, skip another wide string, and then do a check for an overflow, check for where a string is greater than 256 bytes. So all the complicated stuff that you have to do in order to do that detection, I don't do that. And then, again, the generic stuff you have to do for rules, which is reference and SIDs. So all of this gobbledygook and all the offsets and stuff that I can remember, but y'all probably are not going to want to remember, we build it into rule generators and then simple rule stuff that handles all of the background junk for you. So this code's already done. Actually, the reason that there are almost 1,500 rules in NetBIOS rules is because the rule generator handles all the different possible things. So the little endian, sending integers via little endian, sending floating point numbers, sending your strings as Unicode or non-Unicode, setting your strings as little endian Unicode or big endian Unicode. It handles all of the different types of packets that are going to go across the wire, handles generating all of that. So all you have to worry about is what happens inside of the stub data. So instead of spending 4 weeks to have something that might work and you might have a few false positives, I take 10 minutes to write a stub entry like this, and now we have, for every possible iteration of the protocol that ever might bind for DCRPC, we have a rule for it, and it just works. Alright, so where Snort rules are going, one of the big problems we have in Snort rules is there's no way to do extraction of data and do something with it. So you can't do looping. So a very good example of a bug that we can't do in Snort rule is the ICC profile overflow that happened in TIFFs and JPEGs in IE. So this is an example of a rule that actually works. I have written a Snort rules compiler for SourceFire that hopefully we'll be able to release sometime after our acquisition Checkpoint. That'll take this new rules language and either convert it to C or give you a binary object that you can compile and hopefully eventually link into Snort, so you can do things like extract some data out of a packet and say, okay, this is the number of items that are going to be in the packet, and loop that many times, and then do the detection functions inside of that. Like I said, this actually already works. We're just not shipping it yet because a few bugs. All right, so on to the part of the talk where I think most of you probably are interested in is the open source Snort Rules Consortium. It is currently made up of over 200 people in the consortium, generic members, like yourself. And then there are 5 people on the board, Eric Fichtner, Jeremy Hewlett, Matt Junkman, Marty Rush, and Alan, and I can't pronounce Alan's last name. These people are on the board. They provide advisory direction to what kind of projects we want to work on. They don't say, no, you can't do that, or that's not the solution you're going to implement. They just try and advise us and push us in the right direction. And then you all make up committees that will handle solving some of the problems that we need to solve as a community. So I'm going to go over some of the projects that the consortium has put together. That these are things that we need to talk about. We need to set up communities on, and work on and try and solve these problems that'll make the Snort community better. All right. So the major projects that we need to talk about, we can talk about today. SID allocation. So one of the problems is right now, so the Snort team for inside of the VRT has, we define SIDs for all of the official rule sets. Well, so the first, million rules are for us. And then anything above 1 million is for everybody else. Well, so example, the Bleeding Snort team has come along. They have their own project. They generate their own rules. They don't want to come to me and say, hey, I have a new rule, I need a new SID. Well, they have a large list of SIDs. They've started allocating things where we told them to do, which was over, I think, 10 million. So everything 10 million up is a bleeding rules. Well, we told everybody a long time ago, anything above 1 million you can have. So there's lots of people that have their own rule sets that conflict. So one of the things we're talking about doing is doing CVE has moved to a model where the CVE board is no longer the group that you go to get CVE numbers exclusively. There are specific vendors that have their own subset. So like Red Hat, you can go to Red Hat and say, hey, I found a new vulnerability, let's work together. Red Hat will assign you a CVE number, and eventually it'll get populated back up into the regular list. So Red Hat has their own pools. So one of the things that might be a solution for that is chopping up the SID range and giving out pools to any organization that has a valid reason for publishing SIDs publicly. One of the other problems that we have right now is a distribution of sharing rule sets. So if you monitor the Snort SIGs list, there's lots of battles back and forth between the bleeding rules and the Snort community rules, and people that don't really understand that we do try and work together. But there's a lot of different problems that we have. So the bleeding rules guys, all of their rules are meant to be distributed under the BSD license. The open source Snort rules done by the community rule set are all GPL. The VRT rule set is all done under the VRT license. Well, one of the problems that we have is how do you manage which rule set do you get to, or do you pull from? So if SourceFire comes up with a rule that's really good, and Bleeding guys come out with a rule that detected it before the SourceFire guys could write a rule, well, whose rule matters? What should you do? So do you deploy both rules? Well, I can tell you, usually the Bleeding rules work for the specific cases they're looking at. They do a really good job at getting stuff out the door real quick. They don't handle all of the specific test cases that, they don't handle as many false positives, and frankly, they don't have as much of an install base as we do as a corporation. Duh, they're an open source group that doesn't have a corporation base. Well, we have all of the resources to do the detailed reverse engineering. And we have somebody that all she does on staff is reverse engineer, patches, and we write exploits all day. The Bleeding Snort guys don't do that. So our rules are probably going to be a little bit more exact, a little bit more to the specific vulnerability, but both the Bleeding Snort rules and the VRT rules are valid. Which one do you choose? How as a user do you know which one to choose? If you look at it as an ideological base, you can say, well, these are BSD and these you gotta pay for. So the ones you gotta pay for, I don't want to use because they're not free. So how do you decide that as a corporation? Which ones do you use? It's one of the other problems. So that's something that we need to talk about. We need to, do we solve the problem? Is there a, does the SSRC say, okay, the bleeding rule is better, everybody else deletes the rule. The snort rule, the snort open source community rule is better, everybody else deletes the rule. Who decides that? I mean, I can tell you right now, as a VRT member, we're probably not going to want to have some other group say, no, your rule is not as good, so take yours out. So how are we going to handle that? So that's something else we need to talk about. One of the other issues we have is centralized documentation. I don't know about you guys. Up until the last couple of years, snort rules documentation has sucked. They're still not that great. There are a large number of rules that have very little to no documentation. I know the bleeding rules are in the same position that the snort team was in a couple of years ago, where they're trying to churn out rules so fast because there's new vulnerabilities coming out every day, every hour, that they can't get the documentation done as fast as they can write the rules. I know for a long time when I was the only guy writing rules for the snort rule set, I didn't write documentation. I didn't have time. I was worried about catching the vulnerabilities. Somebody else would handle the documentation. Well, since there's a lot of rule share and there's a lot of very similar rules, sharing the documentation would be very useful. For example, there's the same rules that detect WMF in the bleeding snort stuff. The documentation is pretty much the same as the rules that are in the VRT rule set. So the things that are useful that would be great for sharing, where do you go get patches? What is your remediation mechanisms? What do is this useful for an IPS? All those other things, all that information should be shared. How do you handle that? Who maintains it? So we need a group that will work on the centralized documentation, including centralized documentation for snort, because frankly, right now, I'm the only person working on the snort manual. I only speak English. There's lots of people that would love to submit information, submit documentation in other languages. It'd be great if we had a centralized place to go to. So if you spoke French or Japanese or, some other random language, Perl, for example, where you could go to get documentation, it would be great to have that. One of the other things that we really need to have as a group, as a community, is some way to do performance monitoring. So there's this great project that I've sort of publicly bashed a little bit called the Cazz-snort project. They take all the different rule sets out there and they run them through some mystified test set that they're not publishing yet, and give some rating based on how rules compare against each other. Well, this is really good for a large number of people because they have a rule that they have no idea if it's going to hammer their network or not, and they have no testing facilities at all. Well, so they upload it to the Cazz-snort rules. It'll tell them, hey, this is really bad. You had a regular expression that matched on every packet. It'll do something like that. It'll tell you a little bit of the basics, but it won't, because they don't have the amount of resources that like a major corporation has, they don't have PCAPs of 50 gigs a second, or not 50 gigs a second, 50 megs a second of NetBIOS traffic. It doesn't matter what kind of network you're running on. If you take the NetBIOS rules that we ship, you turn them all on a low-end machine, the machine's going to crash. Well, the machine's going to perform incredibly slowly. They don't have any details about what protocol mixes are there. If you're a corporation and all you do is HTTP, well, Snort's going to perform real well. Adding a Snort rule that looks for port 22 is going to do nothing for you. Well, since we don't know what that testing set does, it's hard to validate what it's going to do for your network. So if we could put together a performance testing suite that was open, that you could say, that everybody could submit packet captures of their network, so they could document what your network looks like, and then when the testing software runs the rule set against that, people can get an idea of how their rules will work in each different environment. Something like that would be awesome, where we all work together to get the performance of how rules work. Because I've been writing Snort rules for 5 years. I don't have access to every different type of network. One of the reasons you see false positive submissions on the Snort mailing list is because I don't have access to every network. I don't have access to every piece of software ever. If we all shared all the information, if we all work together to get a set of PCAP that we can share that will work, example traffic of each different service and the different commands that can run in each of the different services, all the things like the false positives and the mail claims that both bleeding snort and the snort rules have. We can work at the fix, if and then there's a whole lot of less duplication of effort. So one of the problems that we also need to solve is the integrity validation. So does this rule actually do what it's supposed to do? If you take a rule from the community rule set and you say, this thing is going to protect me because they said it did. Well, who checks that? Yeah, I write a lot of rules, and maybe you can trust me because you've been using my rule set for the last 5 years, and you have some understanding of what I do. Well, there's a little bit of trust since you pay SourceFire. If SourceFire screws up, you have somebody you can go to. Well, the bleeding rules guys, they're open. How do you know they're doing that on their free time? They're doing it with their own resources. You can't go after them if they do something wrong, if their rule shuts down your computer. Well, so how do you handle the integrity that the rules do what they're supposed to do, that they're not going to break your box, and that they actually, they protect your network instead of just setting off alarms? So we need some sort of, is that something that we need as a community? Do we need to do that? Should we do that? And how do we do it? Who's going to be in charge? What kind of information you share? So that's something that we need to talk about. And then research sharing. So like I said, Lorene and I, in the last 4 months, we've stopped writing snort rules. We have a large team inside of SourceFire doing that. So we've shifted focus. We don't actually write rules anymore. We write exploits, because there's a huge number of vulnerabilities that people are writing ODAs for. Microsoft releases a patch on Tuesday. HD Moore is going to come out with an exploit by Thursday or Friday. David Tell's probably got one a couple of days before. So their exploits not always public. Even if there are, if you look at a large number of the exploits that are shipped in Metasploit, it's a great big binary blob of crap. If you don't actually know what the protocol does and how the service responds to it, you don't know how to write a signature for it that's actually going to do something useful. So we do a huge amount of research, reverse engineering binary protocols, reverse engineering, applications, just implementing, voice over IP and grabbing packet captures and reading RFCs and all that other jazz. There's a large amount of research going on and doing the exact same thing. If we could share some of that research, I know my life would be easier if I could say, hey, I don't know how SIP works. Can one of you all look at it and let's work together on it, and then we can write rules that work and protect us all, and then I don't have to do all that work and they don't have to do all that work, we can work together. Well, how do we do that? What kind of research do we share? I know one of the problems that we're going to have as a SourceFire is we can't always share PCAPs that people give us. I know you probably see on the mailing list, lots of people go, where can I submit a PCAP? They're not willing to send it to the community. There's way too many people subscribed to SnortSigs to send a packet capture from your internal network. They might trust me to send them their PCAP. I have a huge amount of PCAPs from people that say, do this to fix this false positive, but please delete it. Well, so there's a little bit of, they trust me as a person to do that. Well, so I can't share that as, a SourceFire individual. I've made a promise that I won't share that. What can I share? How do I share? What's that going to affect our business model? There's a large number of people that are making a business based on writing snort rules. It's not just us. So how do we get them to share with us? How do we not compete? How does the bleeding snort rules benefit on us? And how do we benefit from the bleeding snort project? These are all things that we need to talk about. All projects that the SSRC needs to set up, and all things that we need a community to head, which I'm hoping that some of you will step up and help do. All right, and that's really all that I have as far as a structured portion of the box. Again, this is for you all to talk, for us to work together to try and make our community better. So do you have any questions? Any comments? You're just going to stare at me.
Have you heard anything about openpacket.org, or do you want to hear anything about it?
Did I hear anything about openpacket.org? No, I've not heard anything about it. Why don't you have heard about it, so why don't you come up and talk about it? I mean, I know that you own the domain, but that's all I know.
Okay, I mentioned openpacket.org in the last talk, but I'm hoping that it will help with what you're saying. At this point, it's just a concept because I'm looking for help with it. But the idea behind openpacket.org is to be that central repository of publicly distributable PCAPs. In other words, there's no sense in having to constantly re-implement some protocol if we just have one place where we've got an example of it. Or maybe multiple examples, both malicious, suspicious, and normal, so people can do some analysis. initially my idea was I have so many people that come to me and say, hey, I'm trying to learn how to do this type of work. Can you share data with me? And I say, well, you know, I've got some stuff that I've staged, or I can't share production data. So my thought is, let's just make a place where everything can go. You can download it for whatever purposes you like, and hopefully that will solve some of these problems, or at least address some of the problems. The problem I'm having, though, is what's the best way to implement it? I'm thinking doing something like Plone, but then, of course, we're going to need bandwidth, but I've just talked to some of the New York City BSD users groups, and I think they might host it for us. So if you have any interest, like especially if you have Plone development experience, or even you have an idea of how you want to divide up the data such that it would be easily accessible, and browsable, and searchable, and things like that, just send me an email, Richard at taosecurity.com, and I'd be interested in hearing from you. Thank you.
Yeah, it's something that would be really useful. I hope somebody helps them out. Anybody else got stuff they want to talk about? Questions on the stuff that I talked about?
When do you think we could see like the new rules language implemented, and maybe Snort 3.0? Can you talk a little bit about Snort 3.0?
I can talk a little bit about Snort 3.0 stuff. So one of the things that we're working on doing is adding shared object support. So we can make, you can provide your own DLLs for your own detection options. So you can, do a large amount of development and not really impact the rest of Snort. So right now, if you're writing, let's say, if you've seen my talks in the past, I've written SP Perl. So it's a detection plugin written in Perl. It does lots of really odd stuff. Not really useful for most people, and it's a pain in the butt for me to maintain. Because I have to patch. On every time we release a new version of Snort, I have to release a new version of SP Perl because they change a couple of different header files every time, and I've got to release a new diff. Well, for me, as a developer, that sucks. Well, so one of the things that we're working on doing, we haven't, as you probably know, because you monitor the CVS stuff, we have not published that one yet. So we're working on so you can add your own, detection plugins, your own preprocessors. So, for example, I wrote a gzip preprocessor because I wanted to test this idea that, somebody commented, oh, it would be so easy to write a gzip preprocessor for HTTP. Well, so I added one. Yeah, we're not going to release it because the performance sucks. But one of the things that would be great as a developer, cook something up, the 10, 15, really to do a gzip preprocessor, it's only, 30, 40 lines of code that actually do anything useful. There's a little bit of setup and stuff that you have to take care of. But for the most part, the actual work is really small. Being able to package that up and put it somewhere so you never have to touch it again, it'll just always work in all versions of Snort forwards. It's something we're working towards. We are looking to a new rules language. Like I said, this rules language is implemented. Right now, I have written a Perl-based compiler that translates to C, and we can make shared objects that link into Snort. It's done. It's just there's a lot of issues that we need to work out, including licensing. So the question was, is there an existing project that looks for taxonomy of network protocols and PCAPs and captures and how traffic works? The way, from my understanding, is the only thing that exists are RFCs. There's a group, there's a large amount of people that use Ethereal. They do have some PCAPs for some of the protocols they decode on the Ethereal website. They provide some documentation for what their filters do. For the most part, no, there's not. If you look at all the Ethereal stuff, they get a lot of it wrong. I mean, it's just software that's written by people. People make mistakes. Well, there isn't a really good place to centralize what things are right, what things are wrong in Ethereal other than sending a bug. If you just send them an email and say, this protocol is wrong, this field is actually this, they say, I don't want to talk to you, and then they filter you, and then they never respond to you. Trust me, I know. There isn't really a good project to do that. It would be something fairly useful to do. Whether we tie it directly to the Snort, the open source Snort community, maybe, maybe not. There's a large number of people that don't use Snort that would really find that useful. There are other IDSs. Why you'd want to run them, I don't know. But there are people that deploy them in a production environment. They would probably benefit from having a PCAP archive. They would benefit from somebody going through this protocol and actually documenting what each of these fields mean. I know one of the problems that we find whenever we're reverse engineering a new protocol is the documentation for stuff sucks. If you want to go look at how DNS works, yeah, there's RFCs, but there are RFCs that were written a really long time ago using math and large other big words that when you've got 5 hours to before an exploit comes out, reading an RFC is not going to help. And there's no example code that generates that packet. There's not example code that decodes that packet. There's not a broken out packet capture that you can visualize, other than if you open up your TCP Stevens book.
I did want to say something. If you're going to write a new protocol and you want me to be able to reverse engineer it real fast, for the love of God, add a sample header in a freaking box that's got like 4 bytes this, 8 bytes this, like in the books that we all read when we were learning this stuff. That'd be spectacular.
Yeah. So I'm sure you all have a copy of the TCP Stevens books. In the back of the books, they have the TCP headers. For TCP, that's great. For DNS, it doesn't have that. For IP, I think that really the only reason IPv6 hasn't been implemented as far as and wide is because Stevens died before he could write the IPv6 book. So he could have the nice packet header broken out. Because it doesn't exist, it hasn't really been deployed as widely. So yeah, that would be something that would be really useful. I mean, I have my own personal charts of, this packet is, in HTTP, it's going to be line-based, it's semicolons for the headers, double new line starts the data of the request. Yeah, I have lots of little notes to myself. Probably I should publish that so other people can see it. I might even be able to write a book on it. But there's lots of people that are doing the exact same thing. It would be great. If somebody set up a project, I know I submit to it. I don't want to run the project. I got way too much to do. But I know I would love to see that, and I would help submit to it. So run the project. Send us an email. I have business cards, and I'll publish the hell out of the project if you want to do it. Because I know that there are people that need it. Oh, good God, every day I got 30 or 40 emails saying, I don't know what the snort rule does because this protocol doesn't match what the snort rule does. And if I could point somebody to somewhere else that said, no, it doesn't matter what the RFC says, that's not how anybody implements it, this is how it actually works, that'd be great, and I wouldn't have to respond to so many emails. Well, ignore so many emails. So, does anybody have anything else they want to talk about?
Have you ever worked with the Purdue project?
Which Purdue project are you talking about? They have a couple 100,000.
The one of they integrate Snort.
A Purdue project that integrates Snort, what are they integrated into?
No, the thing of hosts and network ideas.
No, I have. So have I worked with a project from Purdue that integrates Snort with?
No, Purdue, no, Prelude.
Oh, Prelude. Oh, okay.
Prelude.
For some reason, I thought you said Purdue
No.
as the university or the chicken. No, the Prelude project that integrates a bunch of different IDSs and a host into a generalized IDS framework with some host intrusion detection stuff mixed into. Have I used it? Yeah, I used it a while ago. It doesn't do what I need. Before I started at SourceFire, I wrote an intrusion detection console that did everything that I needed. They hired me at SourceFire because my console was blown away what the SourceFire stuff could do, and a bunch of the customers in my previous job said, no, we're not buying SourceFire gear because this stuff that we get's free. So at the time, the Prelude stuff didn't handle what I need, didn't handle the capabilities, couldn't handle the load. I haven't looked at it since. Anytime I need to look at an IDS event GUI, I look at the one that I get paid to develop. Or, well, that and Squeal, because sometimes people ask me to break it.
Squeal is very breakable.
All right. Anybody else? Comments, questions? Somebody else want to rant for a second?
No point, just point.
Okay, so tell us how you got your jobs.
Okay. So how did I get my job? All right. I guess I started working with Snort in college. My Snort, like 0.8 something or other, I was working as the system administrator for the math department and the CS department at the same time, running their networks. I asked our network security guy, hey, can I run this new Snort project? I want to detect if people are breaking into our stuff. He said, if you can detect people breaking into your stuff, that's less work that I got to do, go for it. So I started running Snort internally and at the university I was at. Long since I left the university, I kept getting emails from Snort. Actually, the most stable version of Snort I've ever seen is the Snort 0.9.1. It's the pre-stream reassembly, pre-fragmentation, pre-HTTP, everything. It was just packet grep. I still get emails to this day from the IDS system that I set up, 6, 7 years ago, I guess now. It shows how great the system administrator that followed me is, because I haven't reinstalled that box and left it plugged into the network. But anyway, so I started looking at packets a really long time ago. I got hired at MITRE thanks to my good buddy Beetle, one of the Shmoo. He interned there. He interned there for one summer. When he left to go back to school, when he graduated, they said, please God, you know anybody at school that's anywhere near as bright as you guys. Beetle, said, if you think I'm bright, you should talk to these two guys, myself and my best friend. So they hired both me and my best friend, sight unseen, to work for MITRE, fairly big government contractor, just because of the reputation that Beetle had. So we started working there. They saw what I had done with Snort. My best friend Dave was big into databases. They took the two of us and said, guess what? We have this big corporate IDS system that needs some work. You guys are new. We're going to stick you with that project. The project that nobody wants to deal with, they gave it to us. Well, the two of us spent about a year developing software. Now they've since shut it down for some corporate solutions. Now that both of us are not working on the project. In a year, we went from being able to basically use the ISS console to deploying over 30 sensors and handling over 30 million events a day, and actually being able to analyze that as a user with only about an hour to spend looking at the console. We wrote a lot of automated tools. We wrote a lot of heuristic analysis software. From that, Marty started SourceFire. I was talking with Marty all day long, every day on IRC, where all of us were when it was just an open source project, up till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. Basically, I told him, as soon as you have a company that has health insurance, call me. It took him a while to get health insurance for his employees. When he found he had health insurance, I jumped ship to go work for Marty and start up run by my buddy. And that's how it's been. When I started, we were fairly small, so I was both one of the primary GUI developers and the only signature writer, and since then they've added 7 or 8 more people to our team for writing rules. And now I do that. Now I no longer even write rules. I write code generators so other people can write rules without making mistakes. So I don't have to QA their work as much. And then I write exploits almost all day with Lorraine. I talked to how Lorraine got her job at SourceFire. We have it, so there's this company. Okay, you can talk about how you got your job at SourceFire.
So yeah, I had been working with SourceFire because I was working for another company that did static analysis. So I would go on site with SourceFire and we'd, go through code and do a lot of beta testing with a lot of their stuff. So after I'd been doing that for a couple months, I heard that they were looking for someone to do vuln dev, which I really wanted to do. So I had a talk with them and I said, you want to pay me to write exploits? And they said, yeah. And I said, what else do I have to do? And they said, research. And I said, you're going to pay me to do that? And they said, yes. And so I moved.
Yeah, we actually, for quite some time, she worked for her previous company. We sat once, every day, 1 day a week. We did static code analysis on open source projects and found vulnerabilities and released patches to various different open source software. So we did that for a long time, and we found that she actually knew what she was talking about when it came to buffer overflows and heap overflows and all that other stuff. So we asked her to come work for us, and so she did. All right, so does that answer your question? That was probably a long, detailed, not joke. All right, anybody else have any questions? Anything about Snort? I can answer most things about SourceFire except money. We're getting bought soon. What do you mean?
What are your recommendations for high bandwidth Snort implementations?
right, so what are my recommendations for high bandwidth snort implementations? Well, I have one. My first recommendation is buy our gear. Duh. So we have a gigabit capable sensor, our IS3000, which will do full duplex GigE with no problems if most of your network is HTTP. That's a solution that you can buy. We do it with dual Xeons with, I think, 4 gigs of RAM and high-end SCSI disks. You can build it yourself. One of the things that we've done to increase the speed of snort in our deployments is we have a custom network driver that does 0 copies up to libpcap. We use the same libpcap that's available, with a few slight modifications for logging and whatnot. But basically, the turbo packet patches that exist for Linux with our own custom driver to pass it with a 0 copy up into libpcap. If you want to deploy it on your own, we have another company that we're doing a PowerPC architecture that splits and does load balancing across it. Our IS 5500, it can do supposedly it can do up to 5 gigs at one box. If you want to build your own, there's a couple of things that you need to do. The first thing you need to do is profile your network, figure out what's going on in your network. If you're mostly HTTP, you can get away with a lot more because of HTTP inspect. You can configure that to say, ignore most of the traffic. If you're, say, a web hosting company, most of the traffic that you're going to see on your network is people downloading pages. So if you're hosting porn, all the movies, 4 gigs of movies, you don't really need to look inside that 4 gigs of movies to see if they're, if somebody's trying to exploit something. Most of the time, you don't care about what happens to your clients. You assume that your servers are not going to attack your clients. So what we do is we quite frankly cheat. We say by default, we say all the HTTP traffic after the first 300 bytes. So generically, after the headers of the HTTP session are from the server, we drop all that traffic and we just ignore it. We let it through and just ignore it. We don't do any detection on it. That gives us a huge boost in speed. So, instead of looking at 4 gigs of data for an HTTP session, you're only looking at, approximately a couple hundred K. So there's a huge amount of data that you're ignoring. If you're HTTP, you can get away with a lot more. So if you're not HTTP, the things that you need to do, you need to use really high-end CPUs. So the dual-core Xeons work great for us with lots of RAM. Really fast disks for your data logging. Use the unified output in Snort, which has the least amount of overhead for running your alerts to disk. Then you need to do things like use a different compiler than GCC. GCC is great, creates a lot of portable code. Makes it's great for people to have their own compiler on their system they don't have to pay for. But because you don't pay for it, it's not as good. It doesn't have as much optimization as, say, the Intel compiler or the Wacom compiler. Go buy a commercial compiler that is designed for that architecture. I know AMD is working on a compiler you can run their code. If you run the Snort stuff through the AMD's compiler that they're working on, you get a massive increase in speed, upwards of 60%. If you run the Snort stuff through the Intel compiler, in ICC, we get a 33% speed increase by using Snort compiled with ICC alone, and just from switching compilers. So using a compiler that's designed for your architecture gains you a lot. The other things you can use cards that do there are cards available that will do near 0 copy up into the operating system from your network cards into libpcap. There's a company called Endis. They sell fairly expensive, on the order of 4 or 5 grand per card. Cards that will do full duplex GigE and pass up into libpcap, with no copy. What does hard carries talk?
I think it's a lot of stuff with hardware, PPAs, probably.
Right. Well, if you wanted to do a fairly large amount of development on your own, you could use a custom FPGA and go to hard carries talk and learn how to do that, and implement your own NDS driver. If you're in Windows land, write your own NDS driver. If you look at the way that a large number of the IDSs that run inside of Snort or inside of Windows, they don't use WinPCAP. WinPCAP is not all that fast. Because of the way that it hooks to be as portable as possible. If you provide your own network driver, your own NDS driver that does as little amount of data as possible, just pass it up as quickly as possible with as least amount of copies, you'll go faster. If you look at ISS, one of the reasons they go so fast is not because they're not using PCAP, it's because they wrote their own Intel Ethernet card driver. So if you could write your own Intel Ethernet driver, or buy somebody else's network cards that's designed just for packet sniffing, and use one of those, like the NDIS cards. Those will gain you a huge boost of speed. I know AOL is claiming they have a couple of things that'll do way up in the OC levels of network traffic, OC12s and OC48s on fairly low-end commodity PCs. The only difference is they have their own custom network card drivers, and they're not doing stream reassembly. And then they can do that across all their bizarre AOL traffic, and they're having no problems, no packet loss. And the other things you need to worry about for high-end deployments is you need to worry about where you're storing your data. If you're using ACID and you think that you're going to be able to survive in a high-end deployment, it's not going to work. ACID splits the data across, the last time I checked on it, 12 to 15 tables depending on how you configured it. That's way too many tables and there's way too much data normalization. It's a great research project. You can get a lot of data out of it, but you're not going to be very fast. So one of the talks that I gave a number of years ago, the Squeal guys took my slide that I gave of how to store the IDS data in a database and do it fast, and what things you need to index on to use on a regular basis. They built that directly into Squeal. So one of the things that they do is right. They take the data and store it as just the data that you need to look at. So the source IPs, the ports, the timestamps, and the protocol, and the event IDs, instead of storing the great big long strings. So for the example that's on the screen, the web client TIFF ICC big Indian overflow, instead of storing that great big string like ACID does, store the SID 999 rev1, and that's it. So the only projects that I know that do that right are the SourceFire project, that it's kind of expensive, and the Squeal project. So you need not only the high-end IDS gear, but you need the high-end database and the interface to deal with it. You're welcome. Anybody else have any questions? Comments?
Best OS? Best OS to launch?
Well, there's a couple of different arguments on this. The way that I look at it is the OS that you're most comfortable with.
What was the question?
Okay, sorry. What's the best OS to run Snort on? It's whatever you're most comfortable with is my answer. The fastest we can get right now is on the Linux platforms. One, because we have our own custom network driver, and it's easiest for us to write it in Linux. The driver interface is pretty easy to write to. The memory models that Linux have, pretty decent. It's one of the few SMP kernels that actually perform really well. So we use the hell out of SMP in our high-end boxes. So we bind Snort to use just one CPU. The Snort's not multi-threaded. We use Snort to make that bind the CPU affinity to say bind to CPU 1, and then all the other stuff to your database interface and all your admin tools just use the other CPU, and then all the other stuff that you're doing doesn't affect Snort's processing. So for our uses, we just use Linux. I know FreeBSD has a large amount of stuff that would be useful for it. There's people that have drivers of it already that will do zero-copy packets, zero-copy packet drivers for FreeBSD already. They're not public yet. When they do, FreeBSD will probably blow Linux way out of the water. More questions? All right. Is that it? All right, well, I guess thank you for coming. I know SourceFire is helping to sponsor the party tonight, so have some beer on us.
No interaction.
So we even have power here.